May 2026, we are in the 5th year and day 86 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will actually see territorial gains on both sides. We will also look at how ammunition depots and other important targets are once again being targeted by drones. And what we will also look at are the words of the head of the Ukrainian General Staff, as well as the words of Russian citizens who were able to experience attacks on Moscow up close in recent days. You know how it works here, short and concise reports without unnecessary talk. So let's get started right away. Russian sources report the capture of the village of Volkovka in the Kharkiv area by units of the 126th Motorized Rifle Regiment of the North Group. According to the report, the last Ukrainian forces of the 159th Mechanized Brigade were pushed out of the village after Ukrainian assault groups had previously been deployed to stabilize the front line. Let's take a look at the whole situation on the map. We are here in the Kharkiv area at this point. Everything here within the dashed red line is what Russia wanted to capture almost 3 years ago now. And we are located east of Vovchansk, a city with surrounding villages that are still being fought over. This is the section we're discussing. A few weeks ago, the Russians crossed the border here and fought battles. We covered this in the earlier situation report. They were reported in these 3 villages, each time in the north. And the Ukrainians reacted relatively quickly and started taking countermeasures, for example, with the occasional counterattack, which logically followed immediately afterwards. The situation has stabilized quite well here. There are still some isolated Russian units that are located somewhere around here. Here it seems to be different now. Why is this area up here actually yellow and only this small tip down here red? The reason is that we have very precise geolocations from here, while we don't know exactly what the situation is like up here right now. Which is why, as I said, we can say with certainty where the Russians are in this red area. Here in the yellow area, yes, there are always reports of some fighting or skirmishes, but without being able to really geolocate them precisely here. So what we know is that the Russians are here with the units of the 126th Motorized Rifle Regiment were able to penetrate into the northern part of the village, which also means for us they were able to cross the defensive lines and are now, so to speak, operating here on a small bridgehead. Now here it will be either what we know is that the Russians are trying to capture this important road here because it leads from the Motorized Rifle Regiment in the north of the village to the river. What we also know at this point is if they control these bridges, then they can bring further reinforcements from the north to the Russians with the units of the 126th Motorized Rifle Regiment against Ukrainian attacks in this case. And if they were able to hold out long enough, they could penetrate into the village. Then they can advance further west and link up here with the units that are still stuck in Vovchansk. And then you would have a pretty large extension of the front here, which would of course be very optimal for the Russians. But for the Ukrainians, the whole thing would be very suboptimal. They would lose important positions here that have prevented the Russians from breaking out of Vovchansk. Alternatively, what is also possible is that after strengthening in this location, they move further east and ensure that other Russians here could not connect with those advancing from the north to support them so that here again Russian units can gain ground. But the first option is simply smarter for the moment. There are several geolocations, but I hardly have any geolocations here from the south of the village. The Russians claim they've taken the whole village, but the Russians always claim they've taken an entire village. Sometimes they're not even near the place they've supposedly captured. We also saw that in the situation report 2 or 3 days ago. At this point, I can say with high certainty that they're here in the north because I have geolocations for that. But it fits a pattern we've seen on several front sections by now. Russia is increasingly isolating smaller defensive position networks from each other, rather than attempting frontal breakthroughs everywhere. As soon as individual locations can only be supplied by a few roads in the north, the pressure on the defense increases quickly, which can become a major problem for the Ukrainians again. So what's important here is to know, or also that The Ukrainians managed to push them out again and force the Russians back across the river. That would be very optimal for the Ukrainian side. Then they would have this side more or less secure again. On the other hand, we also know that the 159th Mechanized Brigade is defending here, and it's relatively new, yes, the 159th. It was only formed after the summer offensive of 2023, and actually well after the summer offensive. That means that in terms of equipment and training, they are always behind other brigades. That they are being used for this kind of mission here, I'll just call it small-scale fighting. That's actually quite plausible, yes. I mean, they also need combat experience, and in my opinion, something like this is always suitable for that, since the Russians have limited resources rather than deploying them to a very important front section. But on the other hand, you shouldn't forget that on the Russian side, there is a motorized rifle regiment. The Russians, they send their motorized rifle regiments into the attack. We saw that with yesterday's mine-clearing operation as well. They don't care at all if there's a minefield there. They don't care at all if there's Ukrainian machine gun fire there. They don't care at all if out of 20 attacks with 100 men each day, maybe only 10 come back. They just don't care. And the Ukrainian side has to be able to compensate for that somehow without at the same time being able to inflict losses on the Russians, or not as much. If the Ukrainians can't react quickly enough and the Russians manage to capture the place, as I said, they have quite a big problem because the Russians can reconnect here, and they will probably try to do that. During the attack on the Stovo refinery, the main distillation unit, AVT-6, was reportedly hit. That's exactly where crude oil is split into its various base products. So it's clear that the Russians targeted this.
6 getroffen worden zu sein. Genau dort wird Roh.
Without it, the refinery can barely function. Modern refineries are complex. Frequent hits to central processing units make it harder to maintain stable production, get spare parts, and perform repairs during the war. New footage shows a Ukrainian fiber optic drone striking a Russian ammunition depot that was apparently set up in a former cattle barn. The drone first flies through the building, films the stacked wooden crates full of ammunition, and then heads directly into the storage area. Parts of the depot are already burning at this point. It's interesting to note, wooden crates full of ammunition, and then it heads directly into the storage area. Depot fires show Russians are using improvised storage, like barns, workshops, tunnels, and bridges, to hide ammunition from Ukrainian reconnaissance. This highlights the danger of open storage sites. Using a fiber optic drone makes it much harder to counter with electronic warfare, because the control link does not rely on conventional radio. Even if the Russians from the rifle regiment protect the depot with jammers, the control does not run over classic radio. That means even if the Russians here, the units of the 126th Rifle Regiment, are in the north of the front or in heavily protected areas, the fiber optic drones are becoming more and more important. And the footage itself shows something else entirely. Ukraine is no longer just attacking large visible depots deep in the Russian hinterland, but also small, distributed ones at the front. Such field depots are often more important for the front than the large Russian warehouses far in the hinterland, because that's where the ammunition comes from that's supposed to be used in the next hours or days. Destroying such depots creates an operational problem. Because artillery units get fewer shells, FPV teams get fewer drones, and mortars get less ammunition. Supplies have to be reorganized under time pressure, often over longer and more dangerous routes. Of course, there's also the psychological effect on the troops themselves. Soldiers at the front notice very quickly when ammunition becomes scarce or transports fail. Believe me, because people really do shoot more cautiously then. There are then stock limits up to which you are allowed to use supplies. So the supply lines have to be reorganized under great time pressure, often over long and dangerous routes. What is important to know is that the Moscow refinery was hit a few days ago. After the attack on Moscow refinery, people in Moscow were asked about their reaction, and some of their statements almost say more about moving the country than the attack itself. After the attack, passers-by in Moscow were asked about their reaction, and some of their statements almost say more about the mood in the country than the attack itself. A woman complains that TV only covered Putin all evening, not real news. She notes a major Russian refinery is burning, creating serious trouble for the Kremlin. State television works well for staging and propaganda, but much worse in moments when people actually want concrete answers. It gets even more interesting with the statement of another passerby. He says, "I know who's behind all this, but I won't say it because I don't want to end up in prison." And, that's where it almost gets absurd. The man is practically standing right there on camera and says that he's afraid to express his opinion. But by doing so, he's already revealing how the system works. It's like someone saying, "I'm not allowed to say there's censorship here," while he's actually explaining that there is censorship. But in a true democracy, everyone should be free to know
Meinungsäußerung natürlich kein Problem.
Is that there is censorship. In a true democracy, freedom of expression should of course not be a problem, at least as long as it matches the opinion of the regime. Why am I showing you this? Because it's similar at the front. Everyone lies to their superiors, mostly out of fear of some kind of consequences. They then lie to the Russian Ministry of Defense, and then Putin is lied to as well. Putin surrounds himself with yes men he trusts, so he won't order real countermeasures. This keeps things at the front unchanged, which isn't necessarily bad for Ukraine, which means everything at the front stays the same as before. So that's not necessarily a bad thing for the Ukrainian side. Russian sources say the 126th Motorized Rifle Regiment is advancing here. What we know, I marked them once several weeks ago and presented them in the situation report. The units of the 126th Rifle Regiment in the north of Orziv.
Vorgestellt. Nun hat sich die Lage so entwickelt.
Even though it took them relatively long again, they were able to penetrate the northern part of the village. We find that Ukrainian forces have now advanced as far as the road intersection west of Stepanhursk. That is here at the blue pin. The video clip shown is said to have been recorded exactly there, which would also indicate a Ukrainian gain of territory in this section. The situation for Russian units in southern primers is now much more complicated. Exactly where road links are crucial for supply, retreat, and redeployment along this stretch of the front, those intersections come under Ukrainian control. Once those intersections are under Ukrainian control, or at least within Ukrainian fire control, advanced Russian forces can quickly be partially cut off. And that's what I told you a few weeks ago. Especially small groups in southern suburbs or along individual forest or built-up strips could then only be supplied to a limited extent. And that once again shows how important even seemingly small advances have become in modern trench warfare. Often, it's not capturing whole cities that matters, but controlling specific streets, intersections, or access roads, as these directly affect the front. If we look at the whole situation here, we have a front line up here. That's a secondary attack by the Ukrainians. It's meant to ensure that the Russians can't advance further north again. It also started pushing most of the Russian units down. Back then I said, I'll just repeat what I said in the situation report almost 2 months ago. If you capture the village here at Stepanhursk, you can especially move out in this direction, toward the intersection. And then, for the Russians, there's really only one way left to supply the units of the 108th Regiment up here, and that's along the waterway. And as we can see, this is quite a narrow access point. We have 2 railway tracks here that cross over a bridge. That's basically all there is. If that's destroyed, then that's pretty much it. And if the Ukrainians keep this road under their control, it will be very, very difficult for the Russians to break out here, because they would basically be encircled. Ukrainians are in the north, Russians in the east, and water is in the west. Even though there's not as much water here as there used to be before the dam was blown up, it's still difficult to move across here. It's an incredibly open area, and here people stand out extremely without any vegetation. And even so, I've been told that the area is quite difficult to drive through. But what I can also say is the Ukrainians now have a big advantage here. On the one hand, they're putting pressure on the Russians up here, and on the other hand, they just have to make sure that the Russians from down here can't advance north anymore, or can't recapture the village here, which is, of course, good for them. So it's very realistic that they can manage to recapture this area for themselves by the end of the year, maybe even reach Kamyansk again, where they lost their first positions here at the beginning of the year. Chief of General Staff Syrskyi stated that yesterday, for the first time since the beginning of the war, Ukraine carried out several offensive actions, in fact more than Russia itself. At the same time, he makes it clear what the Ukrainian strategy is now aiming for, to permanently wear down Russian forces and gradually reduce their ability to attack. What stands out in particular is the number coming from Rompokrost. According to Syrskyi, almost 100,000 Russian soldiers are said to be concentrated there. That is about 1/9 of the entire Russian forces along the front. It also represents the largest concentration of troops along the entire front, and that's true for both sides. That alone shows the importance Moscow now attaches to this section, and yet there is still no rapid breakthrough there. That seems to have become part of the Ukrainian calculation by now. Russia is deploying large numbers of personnel, equipment, and drones to parts of the front, but is paying a very high price for it. Ukraine is apparently increasingly trying not to stop that concentration of forces head-on, but to draw it into protracted battles of attrition. Syrskyi's statements about the structure of the army are also interesting. Ukraine deliberately relied on the core system instead of classic divisional structures, which we see, for example, on the Russian side. According to him, a divisional model would have required twice as many soldiers and significantly higher costs, which Ukraine wanted to save in this way. This shows how much the war now depends on organizational efficiency, because Ukraine has long been fighting not just Russian offensives, but also a prolonged shortage of resources. Personnel, especially money, ammunition, and mobilization capacity, must be managed to keep the war sustainable in the long term. And take a look, Ukraine has become a master in drone development. They are now also developing their own ballistic missiles. We recently saw how they use cruise missiles, for example, the Flamingo, to carry out attacks. What we're also seeing are the first Ukrainian glide bombs. They don't get all of this handed to them. They have to develop all of this more or less on their own. In a war where they are already stretched to their limits in terms of resources, and yet we are seeing very significant progress here within just a few months. We're seeing progress here that would be all but impossible for us in Germany right now if we tried to do it ourselves. Because first of all, the reason is missing here, in this case, thankfully. And secondly, we are not in an active war where we really have to rely on the latest innovations, or we simply don't always need the newest of the new, like the Ukrainians do here, who are constantly in a technological race with the Russians. Syrskyi's warning about possible new Russian operations from Belarus is particularly serious. If the front actually extends further, it would put additional pressure on the Ukrainian reserves. That's exactly why Kyiv is apparently already trying to organize its forces more flexibly and more cost-effectively before Russia opens up new areas for offensives. So, now for all the new viewers who are here, make sure to subscribe for free so you don't miss anything. I always report much earlier than most others, and especially earlier than our public broadcasters. Thank you to all subscribers, channel members, and the crew, especially Lieutenant Colonel René Kessler, Dietrich Ferdi, and Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next Situation Report.